Good morning. I'm very honored to present Chris Gill. He's a professor at the School of Public Health, Division of Global Health. He's an adult ID in training, infectious disease, but he...
Not in training, gosh.
No.
Let me go.
By training, yeah.
By training.
It's like going back to fellowship.
No.
Yeah.
Not that,
Gosh,
not that.
Like flashbacks. Like, oh no, not again. Terrifying thought.
But he spent his research career on children's survival, mostly at the developing world. And he studied HIV and TB and pneumonia and many more things. Lots of them you're going to hear today, so I'm not going to tell you more than that. And Chris is also a recipient of several teaching awards. He also received the most honored, highest honored teaching award at BU, the Metcalf Cup and Prize Award. And Chris has been my mentor and friend for the last 8 years. We had regular Friday morning meetings, which we talked about yesterday. And Chris taught me how to be a better researcher. We talked life, we talked science, and I want to thank you for everything you have done for me, for the opportunity to work together, for everything I learned. And I'm honored and very excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks. Thank you,
So
Brenda.
enjoy.
That was very kind, and I do want to say that one of the very best things about being in an academic institution is that you get to work with really terrific people like Rotem. So you were the reason why it is so nice to be a professor. At times there's all the other stuff which is like, but meeting people like Rotem is really the highlight. So yeah, as Rotem pointed out, I'm actually not a pediatrician. I often wonder if I lacked the courage to be a pediatrician. My wife is a pediatrician and reminds me on a more or less constant basis that there are differences between adults. One of the earliest sort of embarrassing moments is when I was going through clinical data that we had collected on our cohort, and I was like, oh my gosh, this kid's got a respiratory rate of 50, and she's like, yes, that's normal. So even very little things, it turns out that I lack the calibration. So it is an odd feature that despite being an adult internal medicine infectious disease guy, I've spent my entire career studying pediatric respiratory diseases. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. Not so much about the pediatric respiratory diseases, because this is not a very technical talk. This is a little more of a philosophical talk, so I hope you'll indulge me. And so I imagine many of you have seen variations of this cartoon on the left. This one I found on this thing they have on the internet called Google. I was very impressed with it. You can type in stuff and it gives you all sorts of interesting information just at the click. It's amazing. So this you probably can't read it very well from the back, but there's this little fellow here who looks like the guy from the Monopoly game, crawling around on his hands and feet, saying he's dropped his quarter, and the policeman is like, why, did you drop it here? And the man says, no, I dropped it down the street. And the cop is of course confused. Why would you be looking here if it's down the street? And the guy says that's because the street light is here. And so it is a commonly used metaphor in research that we often look where the light is but not where the problem is. And that's sort of what I really want to talk about, is sort of this cognitive mistake we make all the time in research, to think that what we see is what there is to see. Since I was sort of curious about this lamp, it's called the lamppost fallacy, I was doing a little more digging, and it turns out that the attribution of the so-called lamppost fallacy goes all the way back to this guy called Nasreddin Hoxha, who was a Sufi mystic from the 13th century, apparently in northern Africa. I don't obviously didn't have lampposts per se, so he must have been talking about a lantern fallacy, but it was the same philosophical idea. Now, in a more sort of contemporary equivalent of this is the headlight fallacy, which we are all very susceptible to. So you know that when you're driving during the day, you can see everything, right? You can see all the dangers by the side of the road. When you're driving at night, it's very easy to sort of fall into this illusion that there is nothing to see. Right? All you see is the cone of light right in front of you, and it all looks safe and easy. You don't see, the kid on the bicycle who's about to go across the road. You don't see that. You don't see the dangers coming, so you sort of lull yourself into the sense of security. And actually, people who've studied traffic patterns have found that during nighttime, when objectively the danger is the highest, that people speed up rather than slowing down because of this sort of cognitive failure we fall into. And it's the same in research. Now, another way to sort of summarize that is that we, in clinical research, we take absence of evidence frequently as evidence of absence. So, I'm now going to tell a story in 4 chapters, which are roughly chronological, starting with the fatal burden of respiratory syncytial virus in Zambia, which is where I've worked for the last 20 years. And then I'm going to talk about COVID-19 in Zambia and why I didn't skip Zambia, as had been assumed. We're then going to talk about some work that actually Rotem spearheaded about delays in care in Lusaka, Zambia. And then we're going to talk about sudden infant death syndrome in Zambia. But we'll go back to the beginning. So chapter 1. So believe it or not, this is me about 30 years ago. A much better version, skinnier, healthier, hairier, in all ways a much more desired version of me. I'm actually a medical student at this time, so I'm sitting here on my back reading, I think, probably Pharmacology for Dummies or something equivalent to that. And the adorable little creature on my lap is my daughter, my first daughter, Bronwyn, who was then about 1.5 years old. And she really liked also to sit with me and study. So she's got her chicken text, and I've got my pharmacology text, and we're working together diligently. Now, that's Bronwyn last summer when she graduated from medical school. So she made it and made us all very proud. She's now training to be a family physician, and a very eager young woman, very bright. The reason I start with this is that when she was just around this age, there was a couple days spell when she'd been kind of snuffling and coughing and wheezing and having a little bit of obviously a head cold. And then around 2 a.m. on one particular night, she was really struggling to breathe and gurgling and obviously struggling very hard to breathe. My wife and I panicked, so we jumped her into the car and drove to the emergency room, which was about 5 minutes away from our house, and they said, your daughter's got bronchiolitis, which I'd never heard of before because I was just a medical student, but which I have now heard about a lot. So, and they gave her some oxygen, and they put a little catheter down her throat and sucked out some of the mucus, and she turned pink, and they gave her a little bit more oxygen. We waited around for a few hours, and eventually she looked fine, so we were sent home. Okay, so easy, right? And this is probably a story that many of you have seen countless times, that kids come into the emergency room or are admitted to the hospital with bronchiolitis due to RSV, and they get some oxygen, and then they go home. Sometimes they stay a few days, but usually the end of the story is, and then they go home. So a couple of years ago, I was trying to understand the fatal burden of respiratory syncytial virus in the United States. And the CDC compiles a website where they list all the, ICD-10 coded deaths across the country, and the total number of deaths in the U.S. due to RSV is like 150. Okay, so it's a number, but out of a population of 310 million, it's not a very big number. So it's a success story in a way. And the reason it's a success story is not because we have treatments for RSV, we have oxygen, right? It is very basic stuff that saves kids from dying of RSV. Now, you can imagine, however, that would not have had a very happy ending if we were in a place where there was no emergency room, right? What do you do when you can't do those very basic things, where even the sort of the simplest basic elements of the healthcare system that we take for granted just don't exist? And the suspicion was that they die. So, now that was not known to be true. So a number of years ago, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation commissioned our group at BU, along with several other teams, to study this question of how many children are dying of respiratory syncytial virus in poor countries. And that led to what was called the Zambia Pertussis RSV Infant Mortality Estimation Study, Z-Prime, which ran for a number of years. The basic premise was that in high-income settings, we know that RSV is sort of a universal fact of pediatrics. There have been serology studies looking at how many, what proportion of children in the U.S., for example, get RSV, and by year 2, it's something like 97% of them, 98% of them have antibodies against RSV. So it's not will they get RSV, it is simply when will they get RSV, okay? And how many times, okay? But as we know, they tend to do quite well. Now, even though the RSV in the U.S. and probably Israel is a disease of morbidity and not mortality, we cannot assume that this is true in low middle-income country settings. Now, another thing that is a general truth in global health is that for most diseases like RSV, what we think we know about RSV in a place like Zambia is actually extrapolated from what we know about a place about RSV in a place like Haifa. And when we try to sort of extrapolate that experience, we really do so at our peril, because actually everything is completely different. And so those assumptions we make are tenuous and risky. And in particular, what we think we know about RSV in low middle-income countries, based on actual data from those countries, comes almost entirely from hospitalized children with RSV. And that is useful, but maybe misleading, because if we're thinking that health systems are failing and that probably the part of the burden of the disease is due to children not being able to access basic services, focusing solely on RSV deaths in a hospital is quite possibly missing a big part of the story. So, there, in fact, have been a number of meta-analyses, particularly by a group up in Edinburgh led by a very smart researcher called Harish Nair, who tries to estimate the global burden of RSV. And Harish's team's data are almost, I would say, 98, 99% due to hospital reporting statistics. And even that is like, while the numbers that they are receiving are no doubt true, they are also strongly biased by the fact that most of these hospitals lack the capacity to do routine testing for diseases like RSV. So whatever you're seeing is a subset of a subset of a subset. Okay? And then we're trying to sort of make sense of that and turn that into a global estimate. So when you see those numbers, reported in the Lancet, which seems like it must be true, Harish Nair himself will be the first to say this is almost certainly not true. It is just what we see. It is just what is under the lamppost, but it's probably not what there is to see. And so what we attempted to do in Lusaka was to enroll every infant who died in the city over a 3-year span of time. And that was between 2017 and 2020. We then were going to test them all for respiratory syncytial virus and for whooping cough using quantitative PCR. And then because we wanted to sort of get at the issue of are children dying due to RSV as opposed to with RSV, we also wanted to collect a little bit of information about the syndrome. So was this a child like Bronwyn who came into the emergency room with cough and fever and shortness of breath and RSV and died? And therefore we can say that this is probably a child who died of RSV, at least within a reasonable approximation. Okay? And then, based on the prevalence of RSV and the syndromic presentations of RSV, we can then sort of calculate what is the total, all children who die in Lusaka, how many of them specifically are due to RSV? Oh, I scared her away. Terrifying. Sorry. Hello, good morning. I thought she wanted to come in, but she saw me and bolted. So, actually a very smart move. So, over this 3-year period, we enrolled 2,286 deceased infants, which I think we should stop and comment on. Because Lusaka is not a particularly big city. It is a lot smaller, in fact, than Haifa. So with 2,286 babies in 3 years, that is a lot of dead babies. This is a lot more than I would imagine we see here. Okay. So the magnitude of the problem is on a scale that should blow your mind. Okay. Now that total was about 80% of all the infant deaths, and the gap between 100% and 80% is partly estimated and partly measured. So one major factor was informed consent, but actually our consent rates were about 90%, so that was not the issue. But not all deaths are registered at the same hospital, so we can only concentrate our resources in one places. So there was a residual, which we estimated was about 5%, which we couldn't measure. But nonetheless, what we're looking at is obviously highly representative of what's going on in the whole city. And significantly, it came from all parts of the city. And what we learned was that RSV was present in 9% of all children who had died. So a massive burden of fact. As an infectious disease doctor, particularly when he studies global health, to assert that any single pathogen, any single named pathogen may be responsible for 9% or almost 10% of all deaths is an astonishing figure. Okay, so we have gone from understanding that RSV is a nuisance in places like Haifa and Boston to recognizing that RSV is probably the #1 killer of children in low resource country settings. So quite a paradigm shift. And this does not require a lot of modeling. This was just little n over big N. It was the simplest math we've ever done in a clinical trial. Now, that was interesting. But I think what was more interesting was this number in bullet point 2, which is that most of these deaths occurred in the community. That means they occurred at home. Okay, so this issue of where are they dying? They're not dying at Lusaka at the University Teaching Hospital. They're dying in the community, in their beds with their families. They're not getting any care at all, and this is mostly the explanation for the disconnect. The other thing, which is maybe less surprising, was that most of these deaths were in very young infants, less than 3 months. I don't think anyone would be surprised to see that. It is basically the same pattern we see around the world. And then when we applied that filter of clinical syndromes, which was based on what's called a verbal autopsy, which is not a particularly accurate way of assessing the syndromic cause of death, we came up with the conservative figure that at least 3 to 5% of all infant mortality is due to RSV. So a big deal. Now, this is a pathology section from a child who died of a non-respiratory disease in our cohort, and we obtained this biopsy using a percutaneous needle biopsy, using a technique called minimally invasive tissue sampling, which is being promoted as an alternative to open autopsy to understand causes of death in low income settings. This is a normal lung, and I can I'm not a pathologist, but this is an airspace that's in the alveoli, and these are the septa that form the structures, and the capillaries will run coursing through these little tiny spaces, which are just 2 cell layers thick. So this is a beautiful normal section of lung. This is one of the children who had died of RSV, which doesn't look as normal. And up on the top right here, we have some of the PCR findings from the sample, which showed Haemophilus influenzae and also human respiratory syncytial virus A/B. A/B, simply that our PCR did not distinguish between A or B, so it's just RSV generally. And so this was another piece of the evidence that these children were dying of RSV, not coincidentally with RSV, but due to something else. All right. So that was the basis for all the work we then did. It now turns that we've been doing post-mortem surveillance not just for that 3-year period, but almost 8 years consecutively, and we just sort of kept going because what we had learned that this process of trying to actually understand causes of death in this context was fantastically useful in terms of generating insights. Now, what you're looking at here is a photograph of the BID office. This is the brought-in dead room at University Teaching Hospital at the morgue. So what is a BID room? It is, as you might imagine, this is where the dead babies are brought when they come in and after they've died at home. It's a very busy place. The morgue at UTH, probably sees 40 to 60 deaths a day, and a lot of those are in infants. So when we were wrapping up our work in 2020, the world was about to explode to this other disease that you may have heard of called COVID-19. And so we went to the Gates Foundation and we said, hey, we've been doing all this RSV and infant surveillance, and we've got this team, we've got a molecular lab, and we've got pathologists working with us, and we've got protocols, and we've got an IRB approved protocol already in place to study this other disease in infants. With an amendment to the protocol, we could turn it into a COVID across all ages surveillance study, and instead of just 4 days to 6 months, we can do everybody and test them for COVID instead. And the Gates Foundation said, what a good idea, go ahead. So we did. Now, the reason we wanted to do this is because we were ready. Now, all of this getting ready stuff here Took us a very long time. So training the team, hiring the team, doing the human resources, filling out all the paperwork, training them in ethical, human ethics training, establishing all the protocols, including grief counseling, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, and setting up the molecular lab, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of this took us initially in 2017 about 6 months to do, and the Gates Foundation paid us a lot of money to do this, and also established a scientific advisory group around us to make sure that we weren't making any rookie mistakes. So I just want to emphasize that, because we had already spent a lot of time building the infrastructure to study this one disease. And when COVID came around, you can bet that most countries did not have millions of dollars of investment sunk by the Gates Foundation to establish this capacity before the pandemic hit. And so when you started to hear all these reports about why is COVID skipping Africa, of which there were many, our initial response was like, how many people are actually looking? Because we know how hard it was for us to study RSV, and we're guessing that most people didn't happen to have a couple $2 million from the Gates Foundation and 6 months lead time to get ready for COVID. And so that, the fact that they're not reporting anything is probably because they are not measuring anything, because they can't, right? And so, like, the paradox is, I'm thinking already this is yet another example of the lamppost fallacy, right? So this is what we found. It's a little bit of a busy slide, so I'll break it into pieces. This is the proportion of deceased individuals across all ages by time between June 2020 and October 2020, which was when the Gates Foundation gave us our first extension on this. And the vertical axis is the proportion of those who tested positive for COVID-19. And you can see that there were a lot of them. And in the middle of July, which was when the first wave of the pandemic hit, it was almost 70% of the bodies in the morgue were testing positive for COVID. At the time that the Lancet and Nature and JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine had all published editorials commenting on the bizarre paradox about where is COVID in Africa. Okay? And to us, it didn't seem like there was much of a paradox here, because it was right there. Okay? But no one was looking. Okay. Now, we went to the foundation and reported this, and predictably there was a massive collective freakout at this point. And we said, can we have some more money and keep going? They said, yes, please, by all means, keep going. So we resumed our surveillance in January, and then we were able to capture a second big wave of COVID going through Lusaka, and then a third. And after we went back to our colleagues and sequenced all the samples, predictably, the first wave turned out to be the alpha wave, the original wild type. This was beta, and this was delta, just as everywhere else. Okay? Nothing mysterious, except that the proportion of people who were testing positive at the peaks got up to around 90% in waves 2 and 3. So, yet again, this Africa paradox turned out to be utter nonsense. Okay? It was simply the lamppost fallacy. Now, down here, these graphs here are a little bit more mysterious, and let me explain, because you're probably not familiar with the geography of Lusaka. But this is a map of the city seen from sort of a cartographer's view. The center of the city, which is all in white here, is the wealthy sort of middle class part of the city where all the restaurants are and where all the expatriates go and have their lattes, like me. And then these dark colored areas are the peri-urban slums where 90% of people in Lusaka live. Okay? So the part that when you go to Lusaka that you see, then people will show you, is actually not the city. The city is hidden, strangely, from you. It is mostly extremely poor. And the dark colors are where the population indexed incidence of COVID-19 was the highest. And so even in a city like Lusaka, which we think of as a very poor place, there's a tremendous gradient of where this disease hit hardest. And not surprisingly, it hit hardest in the communities which had the least resources. A familiar theme. All right. Now, as with RSV, we were very curious to know, did these individuals die with COVID or of COVID? So we did roughly the same thing, which was to try to collect as much information as we could about the clinical presentation of each death. So if someone came in with shortness of breath and respiratory distress and fever and a positive PCR, we felt that is reasonable to say that is probably due to COVID-19. Sure, it could have been due to RSV, but when 90% of the bodies in the morgue are testing positive for COVID-19 and the excess mortality numbers are going up, it is reasonable to assume this is in fact not a coincidence. So in that first round of surveillance between June and October, we had 70 individuals who tested positive. Of those 70, 52 of them had enough data for us to make this sort of, adjudication as to what the clinical circumstances were. So of those 52 who had enough data to make a call, 44 out of the 52 had fever or respiratory distress or both, and 7 had some sort of cardiovascular event. So we deemed that first group probably COVID and the second group possibly COVID, because as we know, COVID can cause strokes and heart attacks as a sequelum. So, which meant that all out of the 52 deaths where we had clinical data, 51 out of 52 were probably or possibly due to COVID-19, based on reasonable assumptions. Now, when we came back in round 2, we had a much larger sample size to work with. Now, there were 327 individuals who tested positive. 292 of those had enough data for us to judge them. There were 73 pediatric cases, and I will say that when we looked at the clinical presentations of COVID in the children, they were very different. And at that point, we sort of threw up our hands and say, we have to be honest here. We don't know what COVID is supposed to look like in an African child, so we're going to pass on that one. We think we're ahead of our skis if we start to make assumptions here. So we pulled out the pediatric tests and just focused on the adults, which left 219. Now, of those 219, using the same strategy, 155 of those were probably COVID-19 or possibly. So 74% of the ones who had a positive PCR looked like they had likely died of COVID, not just as a coincidence. Now, it's interesting that the proportion of possible probable went down from round 1 to round 2. I don't obviously know why that happened, but my guess would be that this is herd immunity. That the first round led to a lot of people who had been exposed to COVID-19 the first time. And so the mortality rate had gone down slightly, even though the viruses had become more virulent, and particularly in the Delta wave, was not just more contagious, but also a little more aggressive. So. And as we did with the infants, we did some pathology samples. And so this is one of the individuals who had been identified before they died as having had COVID. And so we knew this is someone we want to sample. And this is a section of their lung where you can see that the alveolar septa, instead of those nice lacy thin, tissue paper thin airways, are juicy and filled with inflammatory cells, and the alveoli themselves are filled with all sorts of gunk. So this is someone who obviously died of COVID pneumonia. This is a classic picture of COVID pneumonitis. And here's another one that shows basically the same thing. So, now, this all begs a very basic question. Since it was so easy to find, how is it that the true prevalence of this disease that was hitting everywhere else, New York, Mumbai, Tel Aviv, London, Rome, why was it so not accurately reported in this place? So there's a couple things here. In round 1, we had about 19% of all the deceased over this 4-month, 5-month period had tested positive. So of those 70, only 7 had been diagnosed as being COVID positive before they died. And that is not because the tests were negative, it's because they only tested 7 out of the 70. So, again, put this in perspective. These are individuals who, in the middle of a global pandemic of COVID-19, had come to the emergency room with fever and shortness of breath, acutely, and were not tested for this disease, not because the clinicians at University Teaching Hospital are dummies. They are some of the best doctors I've ever met, in fact, but because there are no tests. They couldn't test. And so because they could not test, they could not report. And therefore, the information that goes up to the Ministry of Health and then ends up on the Johns Hopkins Global COVID dashboard website makes it look like there's no COVID in Zambia. But that is not because the tests were negative. It's because the tests were never done at all. Now, of those 7 who had been diagnosed in life, all of them were at the University Teaching Hospital, which meant that 63, almost all of them, were from the community, and their testing was not done at all. And yet, most of the deaths that had occurred in the community in the same way that we saw with RSV in infants. So the locus is in fact people dying at home, but that is a blind spot in terms of the surveillance system in the country. In round 2, we had 1,118 that we had enrolled. Of those, 327 were positive for about 30% positivity. So again, showing that the beta wave and the delta waves were worse. And of those, now the government had had a little more time to sort of start to build up its capacity. And so a larger proportion of those in round 2 were identified as COVID in life, but still only a little bit less than 10%. So we're still looking at a 90% undercount. Now, of those, when we looked at the individuals who had died in the facility, there were 574 hospital deaths. 302 of those had been tested for COVID-19. Okay, but they were deemed to be COVID negative, and this was because they were using rapid diagnostic tests because they could not afford PCR. And so the RDTs, as you know, are not particularly good tests. And again, when we looked at the community deaths, where most of the deaths were occurring, there were only, I think, in fact, 10 out of the 544 who had ever been tested. And so it was a tremendous undercount. So to put all these sort of errors in sequence, we see that the majority of deaths occurred in the community. So 4 out of every 5 COVID deaths occurred at home rather than in the hospital. And there was no testing being done outside of the hospital. Amongst those who had died in the hospital, which was the minority, about 50% were tested, but these were all done using rapid diagnostic tests and therefore missed most of those who were truly positive. And when you put all those sort of errors together, we come up with an estimate that roughly maybe 1 in 10 true positives was ever reported to the government, and hence 1 in true 10 ever ended up on the Johns Hopkins website. Okay. All right. So the question has come to me over and over. How do you know, Dr. Gill, that this was like a common problem across Africa? You say this is an African problem. All your data come from Lusaka, not even from all of Zambia, to which I have to say, true. True. Okay. Could Lusaka have been unique? Yes, could have been. But let's think about this a little bit skeptically. At the time this was being done, the only other country out of 54 African countries that was testing for COVID systematically was South Africa. Okay? And we all know that the South Africans are amongst the best epidemiologists in the entire world. Okay? And we also know that South Africa is a very wealthy country. It is in every way the exception to the rest of the continent. South Africa is an outlier in Africa. It is not in any way representative of the rest of Africa. So caveat emptor. But they saw a lot of COVID-19 deaths in South Africa because they were looking. Okay? We know that the conditions that favor the transmission of COVID-19, or indeed any respiratory disease, are crowding. And those conditions are common in Johannesburg, as is true in Mumbai, or London, or New York, or Tel Aviv, or Haifa. We also knew how expensive and time-consuming it was for our team to set up a robust surveillance system, and we knew that this capacity and this lead time and these resources had not been provided to the other 53 countries in Africa. So it was just likely that that was not being done. So chances are those resources and capacity would be difficult, expensive, and time-consuming to acquire in every other country as well, and probably didn't happen. And in fact, we know it didn't happen. So therefore, there are 2 hypotheses. One, Zambia was unique for reasons that would almost have to be considered magical. Or 2, Africa was in fact everywhere, but the lamppost fallacy. So, now I don't know the answer, or at least I didn't when we published these data 2 years ago. But now we do know. Of course, it was everywhere, because once we published these results, for which we were very unpopular at the Ministry of Health in Lusaka. There was an explosion of interest in this question, and lots of other teams rushed in and started measuring. And of course, they found it everywhere. And so hypothesis 2 is now known to be correct, but at the time, it was still considered to be controversial, though I'm not entirely sure why. Okay. Now, since we're dealing with theological philosophers of science, this is Sir William of Ockham. People who study science or read Isaac Asimov novels, he talks about Occam's razor all the time. So William of Ockham was apparently I think he was a monk, I believe he was in England, though my understanding of his biography is a little bit incomplete. But he is famous for this statement in Latin, which is probably not exactly what he said, because no one knows exactly what he said, but it's non sunt multiplicanda entia sine necessitate, which basically means, all other things being equal, the simplest answer is usually correct. So in those editorials talking about the Africa paradox, there were some very interesting theories being proposed. One was that the outbreaks of Ebola in Liberia and in, Sierra Leone? Anywhere, Western Africa, their response to that had somehow, through osmosis, created this outstanding infectious disease control capacity across the entire continent, absent resources. And that allowed them to contain the COVID outbreak elsewhere, because they were such crackerjack epidemiologists. That is such an amazingly foolish argument, and yet that is what they say in Nature as being a possibility. Sorry if anyone wrote that claim, but it is such a strange argument, particularly as it was the US CDC that had coordinated all the responses in Liberia, not the locals. A second theory was that there are these endogenous non-COVID-19 coronaviruses floating around that created cross-reactive immunity to other strains, which is a much more interesting theory, except you would have to sort of then explain, well, if that's true, why would those coronaviruses stay in Africa and not go everywhere else and create exactly the same effect? Why would it just be an effect unique to that continent? That is a very odd theory, in fact. And how would you explain that? And no one is, and of course now we know that it's just not true. So, now, I'm going to move on. And this is the part of the story that involves Dr. Lapida. I'll go quick. I'm almost done, actually. Which is understanding the stories of the dead. Because when we were characterizing these community deaths in infants, to try to understand the circumstances of each death, we did this thing called a verbal autopsy, which I mentioned earlier. This is simply a questionnaire that asks a long string of yes-no questions. Did the child have fever? Did the child have a cough? Did the child have fits? Did the child have a bulging fontanelle? Did the child have spots? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And based on that series of answers, you can come up and say, this seems to be a pneumonia syndrome, this seems to be a diarrhea syndrome, this is likely tetanus. It's not a very precise tool, but it is the best we have for understanding causes of death in places like Lusaka. Now, at the very end of the verbal autopsy is a question, a glorious question that says to the mother or the caregiver, in your own words, please describe what happened. Just narrate the tale of the child's death. So we had ultimately 809 of these verbal autopsy narratives, and I read every one of them. But as we were doing this, we'd only seen the first 230. And I was reading through these stories and seeing patterns in these tales that talked about about factors that were contributing to the deaths of these children. And I was so intrigued by this that I said, we've got to dig into this, because this is a goldmine of information about sort of the sociology of death, not just the infectious disease causes of death. And we've got to understand this. So I asked Rotem to dig in, and she did, and published a beautiful paper in Pediatrics. And so I'm going to cite a couple of these. So this first story, I'll read it for you. The baby developed a cough yesterday in the morning, but it wasn't that serious. In the evening, it just became dull, not as active as usual. In the evening, it started crying nonstop, and it cried all night. In the morning today, the mother decided to take the baby to the clinic, but she passed through her mother's place, who first decided to start with going for prayers, then proceeded to the clinic. At the clinic, while the baby was being attended to, it passed on. We were told we had brought the baby too late to the clinic, so we went to the police to report. Story 2. The baby got sick on Friday. It started with flu-like symptoms, sneezing, coughing, and some fever. On Saturday, we took the baby to the clinic where we were given some treatment and sent back home. But the Sunday, the coughing got worse. The baby lost the voice and started laboring when breathing. Early hours of Monday, we decided to take the baby back to the clinic. Whilst on the line, the nurse checked the temperature. She told us the temperature was just fine. We should wait for the doctor in the line. And when we finally went in to see the doctor on examination, he told us the baby was already dead. We got confused because it was not long from the time the nurse had looked at the baby, and that's how we went to the police. Now, I should mention this line that they're referring to. Typically, when you go to Kanyama Clinic or Chihuahua Clinic, the mothers will start to queue up with their sick babies around 5 or 6 in the morning and wait for typically 3 or 4 hours in a line with 400 or 500 other people. And there's no triage system, right? And so it's first come, first serve. And so you're just moving up the queue. And when you get to the front of the queue, you have about 2 or 3 minutes to see your case and move. And that is how healthcare is delivered. And so recognizing that bad things are happening in the queue, they've now tried to start doing some triage by sending people down the line with a pulse oximeter sometimes, or in this case, to measure the temperature of the baby, who did not have a fever because it was dead. Okay? But that was not noticed. The baby fell ill on Monday, developed a dry cough and poor breastfeeding. The mother continued breastfeeding with difficulties, vomited each time she coughed for 2 days. On Tuesday in the night, the baby developed severe cough, fast difficulty breathing. Early hours of today, Wednesday, the baby became very weak with shallow respiration. The father went to look for transport to take the baby to the clinic. By the time he came back home with transport, he was informed that the baby had collapsed at around 7 hours. We took the baby to Kanyama Clinic, where we were told the baby was already dead. So each of these stories, tells a very tragic and sad story where the child died of possibly sepsis, possibly pneumonia. It's hard to distinguish these syndromes. But the question that popped into our minds is, did they die of pneumonia or did they die of because they lacked care? Because each of these describes a delay in seeking care. And this is what I asked Rotem to dig into. And so what she did is look at these first 230 verbal autopsy narratives, and she found that 83% of them had at least one delay in seeking care, registered through these verbal autopsy narratives. The most common was the family's decision to seek care, even as severe symptoms were frequently being described, and 28% of the infants had died while traveling to the clinic, and 25% of them died while at the clinic waiting in line to receive care. Okay. And about a third of them had been seen previously at one of these health centers and sent home. So, there's no control to this experiment. It's not an experiment, but it is notable that what we are looking at is a failure of the health delivery system on a systematic scale. Okay. So, chapter 4, and then I'm going to wrap up. Missing the obvious, sudden infant death syndrome. So, as you probably know, SIDS is the leading cause of preventable infant mortality in high-income countries across the world, including the United States, probably in Israel. I haven't looked at the statistics, but I suspect this is true. It's not the leading cause of infant death, it is the leading cause of preventable infant death. I think the leading cause is prematurity, but we can't really prevent it. We can manage it, but we can't stop it from happening. Now, in global health, my field, SIDS is never discussed at all, and I don't know why. So, for example, there's this seminal series of papers published in Lancet in 2003 called the Child Survival Series that everyone references every time you write a grant, and they do not mention SIDS once. The World Health Organization's website, when you go on their website, you can do it today if you're curious, type in the word SIDS into their search field, and what you get are these articles about the economic challenges in small island developing states. But they do not talk about SIDS. So, what we saw in those verbal autopsies, now we're going back, and now this is sort of a second round, seeing another strange cluster of unexpected patterns coming out of the verbal autopsy data. Here's one. The baby was well all along. Yesterday, Thursday, around 1500 hours, the mother breastfed the baby there after the baby slept, and she put her on the bed. The mother went to continue after her household errands. After an hour, she went to check on the baby, only to note the baby was lying in a prone position, i.e. face down, muffled by the blanket. She turned the baby in supine position. She noticed that there was thick mucus mixed with blood coming from the nostrils. The baby was not breathing. She summoned the husband, who tried to arouse the baby, but to no avail. The couple rushed the baby to the clinic. Unfortunately, they could not make it. The doctor informed the couple that the baby was already dead. What I, the grandmother, can say is that the child was not sick as such. It was the mother who was drunk, who forgot that she was with a baby in the same bed and rolled over the baby. Yesterday, in celebration of Christmas, the mother decided to go for a drink with friends, but I, grandmother, got the baby from her. But when she came back from drinking, she got the baby in order to breastfeed him. Then she went to her home, since it was late in the evenings. Knowing that she was drunk last evening and that she has a baby, I decided to check on her in the morning, and I found her crying with the baby in the bed. The child was dead with vomitus and blood from the nose and mouth. The abdomen abdomen looked compressed, and from that I knew that she had rolled on the baby at night. Okay, so this again was sort of a surprise and a signal to us that we are missing a major cause of infant mortality in Zambia, something that is right in front of our noses but is not being measured, it's not being tested. It is another example of the lamppost fallacy. Because verbal autopsies and these verbal autopsies, these sort of free text narratives, are not routinely scrutinized to sort of look for patterns that are just sitting there in the data. So I asked one of our graduate students who actually focused his dissertation on this question and wrote a beautiful thesis to go through all of our verbal autopsy narratives and try to pull out and give us like a plausible estimate of the true burden of SIDS in Lusaka, and the number we came up with was 7.5%, roughly. Now this is an interesting number. It's interesting because in high-income country settings, prior to the introduction of the back-to-sleep campaigns promoting safe sleep practices in the United States and in Israel and Scandinavia, and particularly in the Netherlands, the proportion of all deaths, infant deaths, that were due to SIDS was around 3 to 4%. So to see 7.5% is not implausible. It is right in the range where you would expect SIDS to be. It's higher, but it is not an unusually high number. And the South Africans, who again are the only other country to have studied SIDS in Africa, found that their prevalence was around 6%. So in fact, 7.5% seems to be right on the money for what the prevalence of SIDS was. And yet this is a disease that is turns out to be incredibly common. It's not even a disease. It is a cause of infant mortality. I will say that the irony of this was that we had gone originally into this whole investigation seeking the burden of respiratory syncytial virus. Right? And if you remember from slide 2, the burden of RSV in kids was 9%, about the same as SIDS. And yet to solve the problem of RSV, we need hundreds of millions of dollars in vaccine clinical development. Assuming that the vaccines succeed, we then need complex regulatory procedures in every country that's going to use these. We need Gavi, we need the Gates Foundation, we need all of this. And then to actually buy the vaccines to solve the problem in Lusaka will cost several $1 billion a year. You do not need several $1 billion a year to prevent SIDS. What you need to do is this: put the baby on their back. Okay? All right, so here is another weird paradox of my life in global health, is that we have this peculiar fixation with high-tech, high-cost solutions to important problems, and yet we often ignore the important, obvious, easy ones right in front of us. Why? I don't understand. And I've been complaining about this to the Gates people, and they just go, oh, okay. So, bringing it home, what does it mean to be a resource-poor country? Child mortality in Africa is high. But let me be specific about that. Half of all the deaths in children occur in Africa, on the planet. Okay, and that is a high proportion because it is not a very populous place. 1 in 13 live births in African children die before the age of 5. The risk of death for kid in Africa is 20 times higher than every other WHO region. And yet, in fact, we know very little about why and how and where they die, and, even though there are so many. What we think we know seems to be largely extrapolated from what we see in places like Boston or Haifa, and we extrapolate that at our peril. And the fact that these things are not documented does not mean they're not happening. Being resource poor is not that you have a child with a big belly in the gutters of Kanyama, right, which is what you see on the Save the Children website to sort of pull at our heartstrings. What poverty means in a place like Zambia is that they lack the resources to study nosology. They cannot study their own causes of death. That is the true penalty of poverty, is not the big baby, that's part of it, but the fact that we don't actually know what's going on. We are almost entirely in the dark when it comes to understanding causes of mortality in very low resource settings. Okay. Lessons learned. So, post-mortem surveillance, incredibly powerful, but we must be humble. We must not assume that what we know about disease X in country Y is going to be the same in country Z. We got to listen to our data. In particular, we found that these free text narrative, these spontaneous descriptions of the causes of death were fantastically useful and provided so much insight that we were not expecting. And we must be respectful. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about the general need to be respectful of individuals who participate in our research, but in the post-mortem setting, this is particularly challenging because we were collecting these data from families on the worst days of their life, right? They've just lost a baby, and we are trying to engage with them to learn about this during a point of crisis. And the way we did this was through grief counseling. And so you are probably aware that in most clinical research, you will offer some sort of incentive if they participate. We didn't think that ethically we could offer anything if they participated. That seemed like we were purchasing the death of a child. So what we decided in the end was that we would not offer anything conditionally. We would just provide them grief counseling unconditionally, and before we even talked about the research. Hello, we are here. We are so sorry for your loss. How can we help you? And then they would cry, and we would hold their hands. And after all that had played itself out, then we would say, you know, we're trying to understand why your child died. Would you let us collect some information about it? And at that point, they always said yes, not surprisingly. So here's our team. And these teams take a lot of time and take a lot of respect and trust to build. But this whole process was painful for us. Our main colleague, our best friend, Roy Chavuma, who led the field team, died himself of COVID in the middle of the project. And Magda Mwale, who was our field manager for almost 8 years, in her 70s, died of cervical cancer. So another sort of like example of what we're talking about with poor countries. And with that, I thank you so much for your attention, and I'll take any questions you have. Hi, and your name?
My name is Rana. I work with Dr. Lopidov in the...
You're so lucky.
I have a question about Chapter 2, Lusaka COVID. Did you keep the samples you took? Okay, because, you know, with all the questions about cross-talk of viruses or pathogens or respiratory pathogens, you had thousands of samples, I guess, so it would be very interesting to look at it.
Yes. Yes, we've been thinking ever since of, like, we have this general sense that we're sitting on a gold mine of information, and we just need someone to come up with a clever question for what to do with them. We were recently approached by Moderna, in fact, who are looking for information about the burden of RSV in other populations in Africa. And we're surprised to hear that we had 2,500 samples from all ages of individuals who had died during the 3 years of the pandemic, sitting there in our freezers, who could be tested for RSV as well as COVID, as well as human metapneumovirus, influenza, to really understand the burden of multiple respiratory pathogens over time. And in fact, we've been mining our sample library for years now, trying to come up with other ways of exploring the epidemiology of common respiratory diseases. So if you have other ideas, we would welcome them. The samples are there to be used. If you had the inclination, you could go to Lusaka and work with the team and maybe do some of these experiments if you wanted to. We've got to start with some great ideas. So any ideas you have, come to me afterwards and we'll talk about it. Yes, sir.
Regarding the risk factor for death from COVID, are they different from like the Western countries?
Yeah, that's a really good question. He was asking about the COVID risk factors. So I don't know is the answer. We did look into this, but in a way that I think led to the wrong answer because of our methodology. So here is where I feel like we made some basic mistakes. And typically when you want to know, does diabetes, for example, cause an increased rate of mortality? The study you would do is you find a group of people who are alive and do or do not have diabetes, and a bunch of people who have died who do or do not have diabetes, and you calculate an odds ratio or a relative risk. Okay, we didn't have any living people, so we could only do half of that analysis. So we could see the proportion of diabetes in people who had died and what their COVID status was, but that approach is tremendously biased by sampling. And so when we did that analysis, we actually didn't find many of the canonical risk factors for COVID. But I strongly believe it was because of this thing called collider bias, which is when you're only sampling half of the 2x2 square and trying to draw inferences from that. So I don't believe our data, though we have published them, and I cringe when I think about that. But I don't know. My guess is that these risk factors like hypertension and type 2 diabetes are probably very important there. But we didn't have a living cohort to compare them with in a proper way. So, yeah, question.
Hi, that was a great talk. Thanks. I'm sorry. I'm mystified by this COVID-19 skip Africa question, because you showed in your data that COVID-19 as a percentage increased among decedents, among people who died.
Yeah.
But if COVID-19 was like if the same waves were hitting Africa and were hitting the rest of the world, wouldn't we have expected to see spikes in actual mortality and excess mortality?
Yeah, you would. And we did. So during the same period, we were setting up the methodology to do an excess mortality analysis, which we executed with a group of modelers at Imperial College of London. And what we found is that there was a spike of all-cause mortality during the COVID pandemic in the same way that we saw in the United States and elsewhere. So the excess mortality completely lines up with the assumption that what you're seeing, through official statistics is not being represented at a population level. The same group has done some, what I would say, sort of more like CIA level clever inferential analyses for places where they didn't even have PCR data, but like using satellite images in Yemen to look at burial plots to see the numbers of graves that were being dug over time as an index of excess mortality. And of course they saw a huge spike that led them to conclude that the underreporting bias in Yemen was 98% of the true total based on the number of graves that were being dug. Now, people have said to me, why are you not seeing people dying in the street? And I'm like, well, first of all, nobody actually dies in the street. That's silly. If you're that sick, you're not in the street. You're in bed. So that is a preposterous notion that people are dying in the streets and their bodies littered to the ground. But I also want to say that, even when we're talking about an impact as severe as this, we're still talking about 2 or 3% mortality as a case fatality rate, as opposed to even an infection fatality rate. And so these numbers, while huge at a population level, are still somewhat hard to see at an individual. Like if you're down in the weeds, you might not see this quite so easily. And this is, I think, particularly true in a place where, like Lusaka, where 50 people are dying a day anyway, right? And so if you see a 3% increase on top of 50 a day, you might not notice that. But if you saw 3 additional deaths a day at Columbia Presbyterian in New York City, you would hit all the alarm bells and people would freak out, right? But it's on this baseline of massive mortality already that it is very easy to fail to see the needles in the haystack. And I think that's part of the story here. It's sort of concealed within the background. Yeah, great question. Yes, sir.
Did you try to compare the graph with the vaccination graph of other countries? I mean, here you had kind of nobody actually, I guess, was vaccinated.
Yeah, 0%.
Yeah.
So
and
that's an easy
herd immunity. So
yeah.
You might guess that the next wave could be, a little bit shallower.
We're going to find that out because we kept going. Our surveillance actually just ended in December, 2 months ago. We haven't completed the analysis for the final round. We have done some sequencing, and unsurprisingly, all of the isolates have been Omicron so far. So and the appearance on the ground from particularly our clinical colleagues is that the catastrophe is over. That Omicron in Africa, as here, has turned out to be a pussycat rather than a tiger. But we will see. We'll have the numbers for you soon.
So I'm sorry.
Yes, there's a long line of people who want to kick us out. So
we're going to be in the hospital all day. So anybody who wants to talk and ask questions, more than welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.